The glass slipped. Nairos caught it before it hit the floor, barely. His fingers locked around the stem on pure reflex, and the shaking didn't stop after. It moved up through his wrist, into his forearm, all the way to his shoulder. He stood there for 1 second. 2. Then he pressed the glass against his apron and kept moving. That was the job. Keep moving. The Alara Grand's ballroom was packed, suits worth more than his rent, laughter that cost nothing but meant everything in rooms like this. Chandeliers the size of small cars dropped amber light across white tablecloths. Crystal glasses. Imported flowers. The kind of event where waitstaff were expected to be invisible. Nairos was good at invisible. He carried the tray toward table 9, weaving between clusters of guests the way he always did, shoulders angled, eyes forward, never making contact long enough to invite conversation. His left ankle throbbed with each step. The rubber sole on his right shoe had started separating 2 weeks ago. He'd wrapped the edge with black electrical tape and hoped no one looked down. No one ever looked down. He set 2 glasses on the table. Lifted the empty ones. Moved on. 8 months. That was the number that lived in his chest every hour of every shift. 8 months along and still working the dinner rush because the math didn't work any other way. The prenatal vitamins in his apron pocket knocked softly against his hip when he turned. He'd counted them that morning. 11 left. He needed 14 more days of tips before the next prescription. The numbers were always moving. Always tight. Always just barely manageable until they weren't. He stopped at the service station near the kitchen door and pressed his lower back against the wall. Just for 10 seconds. The baby shifted, a slow roll, like a fist unclenching. And Nairos pressed one hand against the side of his stomach under the tray. Hidden. Quick. He'd learned to do everything hidden. Quick. The fake name on his employment file. The storage room in the basement where he slept on a cot between industrial shelving and a leaking pipe. The mating chain he wore tucked under 3 layers even in July because removing it meant acknowledging something he hadn't been ready to acknowledge in years. He stopped speaking because every time he trusted someone, his life became smaller. That was the truth of it. Not dramatic. Not complicated. Just the simple math of what happened when an omega with no money, no family, and no documentation tried to build a life in a city that moved too fast to notice when someone disappeared. He'd stopped waiting to be found. He'd stopped waiting for most things. Nairos picked up the next tray and turned back toward the floor. That's when the front entrance opened. He felt it before he saw it, a shift in air pressure, the way a room changes temperature when something powerful walks in. Several guests near the entrance stepped back without realizing they were doing it. The host moved forward too fast, too eager, the kind of eager that came from fear dressed up as welcome. Black suits. 3 of them. Security fanning wide at the door. And then the cars. 4 black SUVs visible through the glass facade, engines running, windows solid dark. The kind of vehicles that didn't come to restaurants. They came to locations. Nairos went still. Every instinct he'd rebuilt over years of survival fired at once. His grip on the tray tightened. The baby shifted again, harder this time. His eyes moved to the exit near the kitchen corridor, calculating distance. Then the group moved fully inside and the crowd parted and Nairos saw the face. The tray tilted. He caught it. His whole body went cold from the inside out. Hi viewers, if you were carrying a secret this heavy, would you run? Or would you stay and fight? Dacian Reeve had walked into 100 rooms that went quiet when he entered. This one was different. He registered the shift before his mind caught up to why. A scent. Faint. Half buried under kitchen smoke and expensive cologne and the chemical sharpness of commercial cleaning products. But underneath all of that, underneath everything, was something that cut straight through his chest like a wire pulled taut. He stopped walking. His brother Kaler kept moving 2 steps ahead before he noticed and turned back. Dacian's security lead, Marsh, angled his body forward on instinct, scanning the room for a threat. There was no threat. There was just a scent. Ash and winter. Something quiet and sharp at the same time. Something his body remembered before his brain did. The way muscle memory works when it's written deep enough. He knew that scent. He had spent 2 years trying to forget it, and 3 years accepting that forgetting wasn't going to happen. Dacian's eyes moved across the room slowly. Controlled. He had spent his entire life learning to move controlled. The youngest of the Reeve triplets didn't get to show panic. He didn't get to show anything that could be read as weakness in a room full of people who would weaponize it before sunrise. He found the source near the service station by the kitchen corridor. Small frame. Gray server's uniform. Ash-colored hair pulled back tight. A tray balanced in both hands with the careful tension of someone who had learned that dropping things cost money they didn't have. His lungs stopped working correctly. Nairos. The name didn't come out loud. It didn't come out at all. It lived somewhere behind his sternum like a thing with weight, pressing outward. 5 years. 5 years of hired investigators. 5 years of dead leads and forged trails and quiet searches that never touched the organization's public operations because the last thing Dacian needed was his brothers knowing exactly how far gone he was over an Omega who had vanished without a single word. An Omega who he had believed, for the first terrible year, had chosen to leave. He saw the pregnancy from across the room. The room tilted. Not literally. The room didn't move. Dacian Reeve did not allow rooms to move around him. But something in his chest cracked open like concrete under pressure, slow and final and irreversible. 8 months. Maybe further. His Omega. His. The hands, those always careful hands, were shaking. Nairos was gripping the tray the way someone grips something when every part of their body wants to run, and they have trained themselves not to. Dacian recognized that grip. He had watched Nairos learn it. He had been there for the first time that expression appeared on his face. That stillness that wasn't peace, that was survival dressed up to look like it. Something violent moved through Dacian's body, and he held it down. Not now. He took 1 step forward. Then another. Nairos's silver eyes finally lifted, and the moment they found Dacian's face, the tray shook. Dacian's voice came out low. Not loud. The room was still too public and too bright and too full of people he could not trust. But the single word carried every year that had passed between them, every night he had reached across an empty space where a body was supposed to be. Look at me! Nairos looked away. Every muscle in Dacian's jaw locked tight. Then his eyes dropped, and he saw it. Beneath the collar of the server's uniform, tucked under a folded edge of gray fabric. A chain. Thin. Silver. The mating chain he had placed around Nairos's neck the last morning they had been in the same room together. He had never taken it off. The ballroom did not know it was holding its breath. The guests kept talking. Glasses kept clinking. The quartet in the far corner kept playing something forgettable in the key of background noise. None of them knew that the air had already changed. Nairos knew. He moved toward the back corridor, controlled steps, chin down, tray steady. 1 foot in front of the other. The only thing that had gotten him through the last 5 years was the simple discipline of moving when everything inside him wanted to stop. He didn't make it to the corridor. She came from his left. He heard the heels first, deliberate, unhurried, the kind of pace that belonged to someone who had never once been told no. He registered the silk dress. The hair. The careful beauty of someone who had spent their entire life making sure they were impossible to ignore. Celine Virex. He knew the name. He had seen it in headlines. engagement announcements, society pages. He had tried not to look and had looked anyway, the way you press a bruise to confirm it still hurts. She stopped directly in his path. I don't think I've seen you here before. The voice was smooth. Light. The kind of light that had teeth underneath it. Her eyes moved from his face down to his stomach, slow and deliberate, and then back up. New hire? Nairos said nothing. He shifted the tray and angled his body to move around her. She stepped sideways, blocking him again. Interesting. She tilted her head. You know, the service team at an event like this is usually vetted carefully. A pause. I wonder how you slipped through. The people closest to them had gone quiet. Not all at once, gradually, the way a crowd thins around an accident before anyone admits something is wrong. Nairos kept his eyes forward. That uniform. She glanced down at the cheap fabric, the worn edges, the shoe that was definitely not regulation. Must be difficult, getting dressed in the dark. A small smile. Or wherever it is you sleep. That one landed. He felt it in his jaw. In his throat. In the specific place behind his ribs where shame lives when it's been given a long time to settle. He did not respond. You know, I almost feel sorry for. Her hand closed around his wrist. Hard. The world collapsed into a single white point of sensation. Not pain. Worse. The kind of touch that reaches back through years of carefully buried memory and yanks. His body went rigid before his mind caught up. The tray swayed dangerously in his other hand. The baby pushed against his ribs, hard, like a response. Don't look away from me when I'm. Nairos shoved her. Both hands. Flat. Hard. Celine stumbled back 2 steps. The glass she'd been holding hit the marble floor and exploded. The sound cut through the music, through the conversation, through everything. The room went silent. Completely silent. The kind of silent that happens when a room of powerful people suddenly realizes the script has changed, and no one gave them the new pages. Nairos stood there, chest heaving, one hand pressed against his stomach now, the other still raised slightly from the push. His silver eyes were wide. He was not afraid of what he had done. He was afraid of what came next. Celine straightened. The composed expression cracked for exactly 1 second before it sealed back over. You! A body moved between them. Fast. Not like someone crossing a room. Like something that had already been in motion before the shove happened, already calculating, already decided. Dacian stood with his back to Nairos and his eyes locked on Celine. The room did not breathe. When he spoke, it was not loud. It did not need to be. Don't touch him again. 3 words. 3 words, and every person in that room understood exactly what kind of man was standing there. Not the engagement. Not the organization. Not the public image, or the carefully managed optics of the Reeve name. Something older than all of it. Something that didn't answer to negotiation. Celine's face went very still. Then her eyes moved past Dacian, past his shoulder, and found Nairos. And something in that look shifted into something that had no name in polite company. Her voice dropped to just above a whisper. You should have died before carrying that heir. The room did not hear it. Dacian did. The hallway outside the kitchen was narrow and smelled like dish soap and old pipes. Dacian had Nairos in it less than 3 minutes after Celine's words left her mouth. He didn't drag him. He didn't grab his wrist. He walked beside him at the kind of speed that left no room for a different direction, and Nairos, whose entire survival strategy was built around not making scenes, moved. The door closed behind them. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Nairos stood against the far wall with his arms at his sides and his jaw set, and his eyes looking just past Dacian's left ear, the specific technique of someone who has learned that eye contact with certain people costs more than they're willing to spend. Dacian looked at him. All of him. The swollen ankles just visible above the worn shoes. The way his left hand kept drifting toward his stomach and then stopping, like he'd caught himself doing it and decided it gave too much away. The shadows under his eyes that had nothing to do with tonight's shift, and everything to do with months of not enough sleep and not enough food and not enough of anything. This close, Dacian could smell the exhaustion on him. He kept his voice level. Just barely. How long? Not a question, exactly. Nairos's jaw moved. Then stopped. 8 months, Dacian said. Slower. The math landing in real time in a way it hadn't from across the ballroom. You have been carrying my child for 8 months alone. Nairos's chin lifted. Not in defiance. In the specific angle of someone who has decided they will not be the first one to break. Dacian pulled a breath through his teeth and turned away for 3 seconds. Just 3. Then turned back. I looked for you. Nairos reached into his apron pocket. He pulled out a folded paper. Worn soft at the creases from being folded and unfolded many times, and held it out without speaking. Dacian took it. Opened it. A severance document. Formal. Signed with his name. His handwriting. Except it wasn't. He looked at the signature for a long time. Then he looked up. I never signed this. Nairos's expression didn't move. I never signed any separation. I never sent you away. I never. Dacian stopped. Pressed the paper flat against his palm and looked at it again, like the closer he looked, the more honest it would become. I spent 18 months running private searches. No public traces. I didn't want you to think I was sending people after you as a threat. I was trying to. He stopped again. The paper crinkled where his grip had tightened. What hurt most wasn't losing you, he said, quieter now. Not performing the quiet, just down to it. It was believing you chose to leave. Nairos looked at him then. Actually looked. For the first time since the ballroom. Dacian's eyes moved to his forearm, to the faint mark of bruising along the inner wrist where Celine had grabbed him, and another, older one just above it, the kind that came from carrying heavy things for too long in the wrong position. Something in Dacian's body went very, very still. The same way a room goes still right before a wall comes down. Someone built this, Dacian said. His voice was different now. Flat. Precise. The voice he used in rooms where decisions got made and people did not leave the same way they came in. Someone built the documents. Ran the separation. Made sure we both believed the other one walked away. He looked at the paper once more. And I think they're standing beside me. The storage room was in the basement. Dacian stood in the doorway and did not move. He had been in a lot of rooms. War rooms. Interrogation rooms. Rooms where men wept and rooms where men tried not to. He had made his peace with most of what happened in rooms like that. This was different. The cot was pushed against the far wall, a folding cot, the kind with a canvas surface and aluminum legs that wobbled if you sat on it wrong. A thin blanket folded at one end. A flat pillow with a slight depression in the center from regular use. Above the cot, a water stain spread across the ceiling in a shape that had no name, and directly beneath it, someone had placed an empty plastic bin to catch the drip. The drip was going. Slow. Steady. On the shelf beside the cot, 3 cans of soup. A box of crackers. A single apple. A phone charger looped neatly around a hook made from a bent wire hanger. A paper fan, the kind you folded yourself from a piece of copy paper. Propped against the wall like it had been placed there deliberately, with care, because it was needed. There was a box on the floor. Dacian crouched beside it. Inside, 2 tiny onesies, both white, both folded. A small knit hat, the kind hospitals give out, pale yellow soft. A single receiving blanket, washed so many times the edge had frayed but the fabric was still clean, still folded into a tight rectangle like it was waiting for something. He didn't move for a long time. Behind him, Nairos stood in the doorway with his arms crossed and his chin at that angle again, the one that said he already knew how this looked and had decided it didn't need a defense. Dacian picked up the knit hat. Just held it. It weighed almost nothing. You planned for him, Dacian said. Not an accusation. Something else. Something that didn't have a clean name yet. Alone. Through all of it. You planned for him. Nairos said nothing. Sometimes love doesn't fail loudly. Sometimes it fails because someone whispered the right lie at the right moment to the right people, and two men who would have protected each other from anything spent years apart believing they were the ones who got left. Dacian set the hat back in the box with both hands. Carefully. Like it mattered because it did. Then he stood. He moved to the far side of the cot to give himself something to do that was not standing in the middle of the room trying to hold all of it at once. His foot caught the edge of something beneath the cot. He looked down. A bundle of envelopes. Tied with a rubber band. 20, maybe 30. The corners bent, the paper a little soft from handling, the way letters get when someone has picked them up and put them back down more than once. He pulled them out. His name was on every one of them. Dacian's handwriting. His. He turned them over. Looked at the back. The envelopes had never been opened. The seals were still intact. But they hadn't been returned because Nairos refused them. He looked closer. The postmark on the top one. The address it had been forwarded from before landing here. Not returned. Redirected. Someone had collected every letter he had ever sent and made sure they arrived here. Here, in a basement storage room, still sealed, still unread. Not returned before they reached Nairos. Collected first. Then delivered too late to matter. The letters hit the table hard. All 31 of them. Dacian dropped the bundle in front of his security lead, Marsh, and didn't sit down. He stood at the window of the Reeve organization's private floor and looked at the city below and breathed through his nose until the red in his vision cooled to something he could work with. Marsh picked up the top envelope. Looked at the postmark. Looked at the forwarding address stamped in red ink across the front. These were rerouted, Marsh said. I know. Through an internal relay address. Marsh turned the envelope over. This seal, this isn't a public mail system. This is our own routing code. Dacian turned from the window. Pull the forged severance document. Run the signature against every document signed in the organization in the last 6 years. Every single one. He moved to the desk. Pulled a chair out, sat, and pulled the bundle of letters toward him. And get me the full internal access log for the legal filing system going back 5 years. Marsh was already on his phone. The door opened. Kaler came in first, the middle triplet, broader across the shoulders than Dacian, slower to speak and faster to assess. Behind him, Vaith, the eldest by 4 minutes, which he had never once forgotten, closed the door and stayed near it with his arms at his sides. Nobody sat. You found him, Kaler said. Not a question. 8 months pregnant, Dacian said. Living in a basement storage room. Sleeping on a folding cot with a leaking ceiling. He laid both hands flat on the table. Someone built the separation. The documents. The rerouted letters. All of it. Vaitha's jaw shifted. You're saying it was internal. I'm saying it had to be. Dacian looked at him. No outside operation has access to our legal seal codes and our internal mail routing and enough knowledge of my personal history with Nairos to construct this accurately. He paused. This was someone who was already inside. The room went quiet. Marsh set his phone face down on the desk. The legal seal, he said carefully. The one on the severance document. I've seen that formatting before. Specific margin width. Specific font weight on the signature line. He didn't look up. That format was standardized 3 years ago. By one person. He said the name. Dacian did not react immediately. He sat with it. Let it settle the way a heavy thing settles, not fast, not clean, pressing down through layers until it hit something solid. The name was Aldrich Reeve. His uncle. The man who had sat at the head of the organization's advisory table since Dacian was 12 years old. Who had taught him how to read a room. Who had told him once, quietly, over a late dinner, that an alpha king's greatest vulnerability was attachment. Across the room, Celine's phone rang. She was in the private lounge 2 floors up. Dacian knew because Marsh's secondary team had been tracking her movements since the ballroom. She answered on the second ring. The call lasted 47 seconds. Dacian looked at the transcript Marsh slid across the table 15 minutes later. 3 lines. Short. And a name at the end of it. A name that confirmed everything he'd already started to believe. Aldrich. Celine was panicking now. That mattered. People who panicked made decisions that could be used. But Dacian's mind kept pulling back to the basement. The cot. The folded yellow hat. Nairo's alone through all of it, managing the math of survival on tip money and prenatal vitamins from an apron pocket, believing the man who was supposed to be his had signed papers and moved on without looking back. He stood up. There's an inheritance clause, Faith said from the door. Not asking. Telling, which meant he'd already known and had been waiting for the right moment. Omega-born heirs with a Reeve bloodline confirmation can legally unify syndicate territorial claims under a single succession line. Dacian looked at him. Which means that child, Faith continued, is not just your son. He is a legal claim on 3 separate organizational territories. He held Dacian's eyes. And Aldrich has been the primary obstacle to territorial unification for 11 years. The security footage from the lobby camera, the one Marsh pulled up without being asked, showed Celine at a private side entrance 3 months ago. Standing beside Aldrich. Smiling. The explosion happened at 9:47 p.m. Not a large one. Targeted. The kind that said this is a message, not a mistake. The kitchen service exit of the Alara Grand blew outward with enough force to shatter the alley-facing windows on the ground floor and send 2 of Dacian's outer security team down before they could get on comms. Dacian was already moving before the sound finished echoing. He had been 2 blocks away. Private car. He heard the detonation through the phone line Marsh kept open for exactly these situations, and then he heard something else. A voice in the background, sharp and short, before the line cut. Nairo's. He was still inside. The car covered 2 blocks in 40 seconds. Dacian was out before it fully stopped. 3 of his close security team fell into position around him automatically, but he was already past the perimeter and into the building through the front entrance. The one still intact, still lit, still full of guests who didn't understand yet what the sound had been. He went straight down. Storage level. The basement corridor. Past the industrial shelving and the humming of a ventilation system that had no business humming that loud. Past the plastic bin still catching the drip from the ceiling. Nairo's was standing in the center of the room. Still there. Upright. Both hands pressed to his stomach. Eyes wide, not with panic, with something more careful than panic. The specific alertness of someone who has already run the options and selected the best one, and is waiting to see if it holds. Dacian crossed the room in 4 steps. He stopped in front of him. Looked at his face. His hands. Checked for injury the way he checked for injury in the field. fast and systematic, and trying not to let the shaking in his chest reach his hands. "Are you hurt?" Nairos shook his head. Dacian breathed out once. Then he turned and looked at the doorway behind him and the two security personnel filling it and said, "Get the car. Underground exit. Now." Nobody argued. The penthouse was on the 43rd floor of the Reeve organization's primary residential tower. Dacian had the building's security codes updated before the elevator finished rising. By the time the front door closed behind them, there were armed personnel on every floor between 38 and 45, and the building's external surveillance had been switched to the private feed that ran directly to Marsh's terminal. Nairos stood in the center of the living room and didn't move. He looked at the space, the actual space, the scale of it, the floor-to-ceiling windows and the city spread out below them like something from a different life entirely, and something in his expression did not soften. It recalibrated. The way someone looks when they've been handed something they stopped letting themselves want a long time ago, and they're not sure yet whether to hold it or give it back. Dacian brought a glass of water from the kitchen. He set it on the table beside the couch. Didn't hold it out. Didn't make it a gesture. Just put it there. "You don't have to stay in the room with me," Dacian said. "There are 3 bedrooms. The one at the end has a lock on the inside." Nairos looked at the water. Then at Dacian. "I can protect you now," Dacian said. The silence that came after that sentence was not empty. Nairos moved to the window. Looked out. When he finally turned back, his expression was even. Not angry, not forgiving, just honest in the specific, exhausting way of someone who has long since run out of energy for anything else. He pointed to the floor. Then to his own chest. Then spread both hands outward. "Where were you?" Not said with sound. Said with his body, the way he'd been saying things for years. "Where were you when I needed this?" Dacian held that. He did not look away. "I know," he said. Just that. The doctor arrived 40 minutes later. Dacian had called him from the car. His name was Dr. Ambrose Fennick, the only physician Dacian trusted with things that mattered, and he carried his bag through the front door without asking questions because Dacian paid him not to ask questions. The examination took 20 minutes. Dacian waited in the hallway outside the bedroom door, and did not pace because pacing would not help, and he had trained himself out of visible anxiety in public spaces years ago. He stood with his back against the wall, and his arms crossed and his eyes on the floor. Dr. Fennick came out, and closed the door softly. He looked at Dacian the way doctors look when the news is not good news but is not yet the worst news, the specific zone between warning and disaster. "The pregnancy has progressed under significant stress," he said. "Nutritional deficiency. Physical overexertion. The baby is viable, but the prolonged pressure on the body has created complications." He paused. "There is a chance, depending on how labor progresses, that delivery will not be straightforward." Dacian stared at him. "What kind of chance?" Dr. Fennick held his eyes. "The kind that requires a hospital and a surgical team on standby and no more delays." He picked up his bag. "He needs rest. Real rest. And he needs it starting tonight." The door to the bedroom stayed closed. Dacian sat down on the hallway floor with his back against the wall, and his forearms on his knees, and he stayed there until the light under the door finally went off. The name in the documents was clean. That was the first thing that made Dacian certain. Too clean. The kind of clean that comes from someone who has spent years practicing how to leave no trace and has gotten very good at it. Every forged seal, every rerouted letter, every fake signature. All of it traced back through 6 different relay points before landing on a single internal authorization code. One code. One user. Aldrich Reeve. Dacian sat across from his uncle in the organization's private boardroom at 7 in the morning with the documents spread between them, and said nothing for a full 30 seconds. Aldrich was 63. Silver-haired. Still sharp in the way old wolves are sharp, not fast anymore, but precise. He looked at the documents, and then at Dacian, and his expression moved through several things quickly before settling on something that was not quite guilt, and not quite defiance. Something in between that had its own specific name. Calculation. You built it carefully, Dacian said. I'll give you that. Aldrich set his hands on the table. What you're looking at? Don't. Dacian's voice was flat. Don't explain it to me. Don't tell me what I'm looking at. I know what I'm looking at. Silence. The inheritance clause, Dacian said. That's what this was about. Not Nairos. Not me. The clause. He leaned forward. An Omega-born heir with a confirmed Reeve bloodline triggers territorial unification across all 3 syndicate lines. You've been blocking unification for 11 years. You built your entire position inside this organization on the fact that the territories stayed separate, and every separate line needed its own advisor. He looked at his uncle's hands. My son ends that. My son makes you unnecessary. Aldrich didn't deny it. That was the thing. He didn't deny it. He sat there with his hands flat on the table, and his jaw set, and let the silence confirm everything. Celine, Dacian continued, was never a political match. She was a wall. An engagement that would prevent any legitimized Omega heir from holding claim. Omega-born succession is only valid inside a confirmed primary bond. No bond means no claim. He sat back. You needed me publicly committed to a non-Omega partner. Permanently. You needed Nairos gone and kept gone. Aldrich looked at the window. The child would have destabilized everything, he said. Quietly. Like he was explaining something simple to someone who should have already understood it. You know what unification looks like from the inside. Every rival family watching for the moment to hit. Every power arrangement rewritten overnight. Everything I have spent decades protecting. You hired trackers, Dacian said. Aldrich stopped. The entire pregnancy, Dacian said. You knew where Nairos was. You tracked him. You let him live in a basement storage room with a leaking ceiling and a folding cot and not enough food because he was more useful alive and hidden than dead and searched for. His voice stayed even. You needed him accessible in case the heir became a visible threat. Easier to manage a body you can locate. The cruelest betrayals are committed by people who call themselves family. That was the truth of it. Not strangers. Not enemies from outside the walls. The person who had sat at every family table. The person who had placed a hand on Dacian's shoulder after his father's funeral, and said, I will always be here. Aldrich opened his mouth. Dacian stood up. I want him out of every building by noon, he said to Marsh, who had been standing at the door the entire time. Every authorization code revoked. Every access point closed. He straightened his jacket. And get the legal team. We're filing the heir confirmation documents today. He walked toward the door. Aldrich's voice came from behind him, quiet and hard and final. There can be no heir. Dacian stopped. He did not turn around. Then there will be no you, he said. He walked out. The call came through to Marsh 20 minutes later. Not a threat. Not a confrontation. A contract. Someone had been hired. The paperwork confirmed it. Method timeline target. Nairos. Before labor. One final move from a man who had already lost and hadn't accepted it yet. The water broke at 2:13 in the morning. No warning. No slow build. One moment Nairos was awake in the penthouse bedroom, eyes open in the dark the way they had been most nights for the last several months, and the next moment his body made a decision that removed all other options from the conversation. He reached for his phone. His hands were steady. That mattered. Even now, even in this, the training of years held, don't panic, move, make the next correct choice. He typed one word to the number Dacian had put in his phone before leaving that morning. Now. The door opened in 40 seconds. Dacian came through it fully dressed, which meant he hadn't slept either. He took one look at Nairosa's face and crossed the room, and the only thing he said was, "I've got you." Dr. Fennick had already been placed on 24-hour standby in the building. He was through the front door in 6 minutes. The surgical team was 4 floors down in a medical suite Dacian had quietly assembled in the building's private lower level sometime in the last 48 hours without explaining it to anyone. Pause on that. He had built a medical suite in the building, just in case. The next 3 hours were not clean. Downstairs, somewhere below the medical suite, somewhere in the building's lower floors, Dacian's brothers were handling what Aldrich's hired contract had sent. Kayla moved through the building's secondary entrance with 4 men and no announcement. Vaith coordinated from the external perimeter. There were no names used on the comms. No specifics. Just confirmations, clear, 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 coming in from checkpoints one by one while the storm outside threw rain against every window in the building. In the medical suite, the monitors kept going. Dr. Fennick worked quietly. Focused. He did not narrate what he was doing, which Dacian appreciated, because narration would have meant reassurance, and reassurance at this stage would have meant things were bad enough to require it. Dacian sat beside the bed. He did not leave. He had been asked once, gently, by a nurse to step out. He had looked at her in a way that resolved the question, and she had not raised it again. Nairosa's hand found his at some point in the second hour. Not reached. Not offered. Just moved across the sheet. Until it was against Dacian's. Dacian turned his hand over and held on. He didn't say anything. Words at this point were the wrong tool. He just held on the way you hold on when you have let go of something once, in a way you did not choose, and spent years learning exactly what that costs. The comms in his earpiece went quiet. Then Vaitha's voice came through, 2 words, flat and final. "It's done." Dacian did not react visibly. He stayed exactly where he was. The storm outside got louder for a few minutes. Then it dropped. Then Dr. Fennick looked up from the monitors and said, "We need to move faster." The next 40 minutes were a blur of motion and controlled urgency, and sounds that Dacian would spend a long time afterward filing into categories his mind could manage. He held Nairosa's hand through all of it. He watched his face. He tracked every breath. He was still watching when the sound changed. Small. Sharp. New. A sound that had not been in the room before. Dr. Fennick stepped back and said something to the nurse and then turned, and in his hands was something very small, and very loud considering the size, and very unambiguously alive. The monitors kept going. But one line, the secondary line, the one Dr. Fennick had been watching most carefully for the last 3 hours, started trending in the wrong direction. Dacian's grip tightened. "What is that?" he said. "Dr." Fennick handed the baby to the nurse and moved back to the bed and looked at the monitor and looked at Dacian with that specific expression that lived in the space between warning and the worst news. "The heartbeat is dropping," he said. The baby's name was decided at 5:44 in the morning. By that point, the monitors had stabilized. The secondary line that had gone sideways in the last minutes of labor had responded to intervention, fast and precise, and Dr. Fennick's steady hands doing what they were there to do, and the small sharp sound that had entered the room at 4:58 a.m. was now a slightly larger sound coming from a hospital bassinet 3 feet from the bed. Alive. That word carried a specific weight at 5:44 in the morning after a night like that one. Alive meant everything else could wait. Dacian stood over the bassinet for a long time without moving. His son was 7 pounds and 4 ounces and had ash-colored hair, and had arrived in the middle of a storm and a mafia operation and a medical emergency, and had survived all three without appearing particularly bothered by any of them. Dacian put one finger against the small closed fist, and the fist opened, and then closed around it. He did not have words for that. There were no words for that. He turned. Nairos was awake. Exhausted in a way that went past the body, the kind of exhaustion that needed days of actual sleep and actual food and actual stillness to even begin to address. But his eyes were open and they were on Dacian's face, and they were asking a question that didn't require sound. Dacian brought the bassinet closer. He sat on the edge of the bed, not asking, just sitting, and watched Nairos look at the baby for the first time with nothing between them. No glass. No distance. No story built by someone else to keep them apart. Just his face. Just the baby's face. Nairos reached out. Both hands. Careful. The way he'd been careful with everything for years. Managing, protecting, making sure nothing broke, except this time the carefulness wasn't from fear. It was from something else. Something that had been waiting to be safe enough to come out. The weeks that followed were not simple. They were not a clean ending. Real things do not have clean endings. They have the slow work of rebuilding something that was deliberately destroyed, which takes longer than the destruction did and costs more patience than most people think they have. Dacian dismantled Aldrich's position inside the organization inside 10 days. Not loudly. No announcement. Just a series of quiet, final decisions that removed every piece of access and every thread of influence until there was nothing left to hold. Aldrich was gone by the end of the month. Relocated, contained, no longer a factor in anything that mattered. Celine's engagement was formally terminated in a public statement that said very little and communicated everything. The legal team filed the heir confirmation documents. The territorial unification process started. And in the penthouse on the 43rd floor, in the room at the end of the hall, the one with the lock on the inside that had never been locked since the first night, a routine built itself slowly out of small things. Morning light. The sound of the baby. Coffee made without asking because Dacian had learned, over days of quiet observation, exactly how Nairos drank it. Conversations that started with gestures and expanded, not all the way, not yet, but expanding. Growing. The way things grow when they finally have the right conditions for the first time. Dacian did not push for more than Nairos offered. That mattered. He learned to read the silences the way he had always been able to read rooms, not forcing them to say something they weren't ready for, but staying present in them. Available. Consistent. Every morning the same. Every evening the same. Building the kind of record that trust requires before it becomes real. One afternoon, Nairos was sitting by the window with the baby against his chest and the city below them going about its business, and Dacian came and sat across from him, and they stayed there for an hour without anyone needing it to be anything more than what it was. That was the closest thing to peace either of them had touched in 5 years. Then Dacian's phone buzzed. He looked at it. An anonymous message. No sender ID. Routed through a relay that Marcia's team would spend 3 days trying to trace before confirming it was untraceable by any method currently available to them. 4 lines. One heir survived before. The bloodline runs in 2 directions. You dismantled one threat. History will correct itself. Dacian read it twice. He set the phone face down on the table. Across the room, Nairos looked at him over the baby's head. Not asking out loud. Asking with the specific attention of someone who has learned to read danger the way survival teaches you to read it, through instinct, through the body, through the change in a room when something shifts. Dacian met his eyes. He did not lie. He did not perform calm. He just looked back at him, steady, present, and already thinking, and in that moment they both understood the same thing at the same time without a single word between them. It was not over. It was never going to be that simple. And that was the moment they both realized the war had only just begun. If this story moved something in you, if you stayed through all of it, drop a comment below. Tell me which moment hit hardest. Tell me what you want to see next. Your words build this community. Subscribe and turn on notifications. Every story posted here is built to mean something, and you do not want to miss what comes next.